The Frogs follows the journey of Dionysus into the underworld, whose hope is to find a fertile poet to revitalise the current tragic, in both senses of the word, dramatic status of Athens. In order to enter the underworld, where this rejuvenating spark is buried, Dionysus must undergo a ritual that brings life rising out of death, a process which is at the heart of every initiation sequence, especially those of the Eleusinian mysteries. In this presentation, I will explore the liminal significance of Dionysus' journey into the underworld, as well as how this applies to the spaces he encounters during his journey there. While considering the rite of passage of the journey, we must also bear in mind the liminal function of winter and spring in the Frogs. As Dionysus makes his journey into the underworld, his first encounter is with Charon, who is the underworld ferryman charged with transporting the souls across to Hades, from one bank to another. During his traverse of the lake, Dionysus encounters the first chorus of the play, comprised solely of frogs. The Anthesteria, in which the frog chorus sings, En Limnicin, is a winter festival which anticipates the spring, a time of renewed life, and ends in a day devoted to the dead. The Lenaea, the dramatic festival in which this play was performed, comparatively looks forward to the city Dionysia in the following month of Elaphebolion, which showcases Athenian tragedy in early spring. Therefore, we can envision a liminal marker expressed between death and life, and Lenaean comedy and the tragedy of the city Dionysia. Dionysus' passage is symbolic of this shift to city Dionysian tragedy, since he has metaphorically left the comic realm of the upper world, where Aristophanes cracked stock jokes and introduced a peculiar frog chorus, over to the dead poets of Hades, whose aim is to transform tragedy from the winter of its death to the spring of its rebirth. This death and rebirth which Dionysus experiences is not only figurative of his physical journey, but also of Aristophanes' intention to spread awareness to his audience of the need for a resurgence of old tragedy. The underworld provides the space for such a liminal crossing to happen, as it compares Dionysus' descent and ascent to the ritual initiations of the Eleusinian mysteries. The cult was chthonic, relating to Gaia, and therefore feminine, straying away from the distinctly masculine cults of the Olympians. The femininity of this cult then lent itself to the regenerative powers associated with the earth, conceptualizing the anodoi of its initiates, and in this play that of Dionysus along with the rejuvenating poet of tragedy, as a sort of rebirth. The liminal function of the frog chorus's location, the first space the god encounters on his way to the underworld, is certainly pertinent to this overall theme of Dionysus' journey. The marshes mirror the transitional crossing of the Acheron from one bank to the gates of Hades, and the frog chorus which dwells within the reeds provides an apt liminal creature, one which lives both above and below the water, to accompany Dionysus. The setting of the frog's chorus's song, and the contents of its claims are marshy and patently rustic. The sense of the frogs belonging outside the city can be seen in the phrase, "the stalks that I grow in lake water," which is echoed in the second strophe by the watery dance in the swampy depths. This mode of poetry is nimble, bubbly, pomphologo-paplasmasin, bubbly propifications, and playful rather than full-flowing, and is more characteristic of the Aristophanic and Euripidean styles. There is also a countryside presence, as shown by the frog's reference to the reeds, which were used to make the shepherd's pipes of the woodland pan, and Apollo's forminx, a musical instrument similar to the lyre. The melody of the frogs is metrically reminiscent of Euripides' preference for simple iambs and trochees, and is also in keeping with the predictable oil flask ending that Aeschylus goes on to mock in the literary contest, a sign of Euripides' use of monotonous metre, though also giving the lines a sing-song effect. We may also compare the bubbly metre of the frogs to a babbling brook rather than a rushing river, helping to shape a watery poetics that we can call fertile. Thus, the marshy and bubbly setting of the frogs, as well as their similar poetics, remind us of the rural aspect of Euripides' style. We must also, however, consider the distinctly urban side of Euripides, whose subtle and tricky poetics are testament to his civic nature, rather than the profound and weighty rural poetry of Aeschylus. Euripides and the frogs embody hybrid poetry, using the spaces of both the city and the rural marshes to convey the interweaving stylistic features. We may therefore see Euripides as a paradoxical, newfangled creature, who is himself a literary critic through his poetry, whereas Aeschylus firmly represents an older, grander, and more natural source of creativity. The frog's marshy setting may accommodate the instruments of rural poetry, portraying the hybridity of Euripides, but the initiates occupy the flowering meadows between the stream of Acheron and the door to Hades. The imagery of meadows is similarly liminal, especially when we think back to Dionysus' descent as comparative to the Eleusinian mysteries. The Homeric hymn to Demeter reminds us of Persephone's descent to the underworld, as she is pulled down from a meadow by Hades through a liminal crossing. The initiate chorus, most likely followers of the Eleusinian cult, invoke the meadows repeatedly, sing a hymn to Demeter, and do so in an Ionic meter with a distinctly Aeschylean feature of anaclasis, where breaking up of the rhythm is achieved by the substitution of a long for a short syllable, or vice versa. While the chorus may not retain their identity as initiates throughout the play, they play the role of conducting the god of poetry, leading Dionysus through the meadows and groves to Hades on a distinctly liminal journey. The chorus calls upon Iacchos, the local mysteries' ritual name for Dionysus, as one who can complete the long trek of their ritual song and dance, which must refer to the journey from Athens to Eleusis. The long trek, as shown in Hesiod, may also suggest elevated modes of poetry that would correspond with the more official aspects of Aeschylus's grand style. By the end of the parados, the initiates have entered the meadows, full of flowering roses, where they frolic in their own style of most beautiful dance. Their righteous behaviour repeats the term tropon, which is, in a similar way to their dance, a linking factor between poetic and religious practice in an exalted mode. This idea of a more profound mode of poetry is echoed in the literary context later in the play, where Aeschylus conveys his poetry as though it were a rolling river, stopping for nothing as its stream is a constant gush. The river imagery is very important later in the play, as it helps to metaphorically break down the style of both Euripides and Aeschylus. If indeed the idea of a rolling river is associated with Aeschylus through the lofty poetic spaces of the initiates, then the slighter mode of the frogs of Euripides can lay claim to a different facet of this river's fluid aspects. In order to fully understand the symbolism of rivers within the play, we must imagine Dionysus's journey into the underworld as if it were realistic, starting from the god's route to the marshes, which are representative of the marshes attested to in the Anthesteria festival. These so-called marshes, there were no known marshes in the surrounding spaces of Athens, were located in the area between the Pnyx and the Acropolis, where the river Ilissos flowed. As a result, we can think of the Ilissos as an important space in Dionysus's literary critical journey, and, as a river, it can be interpreted alongside literary styles. Late in the literary contest, Aeschylus, when asked to submit a line to the scales, proposes O river Spercheius, and the haunts where oxen graze, which gives the line its winning weight, solely due to the watery poetics of the word potamer, river. Despite its substantial association with Aeschylus here, the early scenes of frogs suggest lighter associations for the Ilissos as that of a sparkling, fine-flowing stream versus the rolling river. The thunderous qualities of a rolling river are not here associated to the Ilissos, since the marshy setting of this water, in relation to the frog chorus, leads to the smooth streams of Euripides. Aeschylus' style is, however, embodied by the full and weighty river that he so proudly offers up in his winning line. In Dionysus' quest for a fertile poet, the styles of his initial target Euripides and those of Aeschylus are symbolized through the tactile qualities of topographies, inhabited by celebrants of the ritual spaces of marshes and meadows through which the god passes. While Dionysus is initially confused with what Athens needs to rejuvenate its tragic scene, the literary critical process emerges by differentiating and combining poetic styles attached to ritual processions through distinctive spaces along the urban-rural divide. We can see Dionysus' journey through the marshes and meadows as significant towards his emergence as a suitable literary judge, granted that we understand his liminal passage to the underworld and its preceding spaces as a journey that brings about progress in his initial intentions. If we consider poetic contests to be flawed and often based on trivial criteria, the play gestures towards a better grounded literary judgment through its use of rural spaces that offers renewal of tragedy. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Please see my bibliography and list of illustrations for further reference.